Welcome everybody to another Developer Livecast here on the Game Wisdom YouTube channel. Tonight we're going to be discussing the challenges of designing a game meant for casual audiences in the tabletop field, but I'm sure many of our lessons we'll be discussing will be applicable towards game development as well. Joining me tonight are two members of Strife Games. They are currently a tabletop developer and they have a Kickstarter going on for the game Department of Spin. Please welcome Mirko and Ali.
Hello.
Hello.
Thanks for having us.
No problem. It's great to have you on. How are you guys doing tonight?
Living the dream.
Very good.
I know for those of you watching, John Breiger, who we've talked to several times on the podcast, introduced the two of us together, and he has been a really great guest. I know he and I, we can just talk for like an hour and a half like it's nothing about playtesting, so we'll see how crazy our cast gets tonight. But I guess to get things going, for people watching us, could you introduce yourselves and kind of talk about your company and the games you like to make?
You want to start off? Or I'll...
Well, I'm Mirko Michanovic, and yeah. So part of the Strife Games, part of one of, as you mentioned, one of three people that actually made this Department of Spin game. So that's the latest thing that we've been doing. So I don't know if you want to introduce yourself.
Yeah, I'm Ali Hajigufori. I've designed a couple games now, so Department of Spin's the second one that I've been working on, co-designing with Mirko and a friend of ours, Mike Cullen. I also previously designed a game called Take the Gold, a card game that's a perfect fit for our conversation tonight in terms of casual audiences. That one successfully funded on Kickstarter about 6 months ago and is being fulfilled as we speak. So if there's any listeners who backed Take the Gold, if you haven't already received that package, it should be coming like any day now. So that's kind of what I've been working on so far this year, really.
Okay. And for Take the Gold and Department of Spin, what kind of like games are they? I know obviously they're tabletop games, but like what kind of design are you did you approach with them?
Well, as far as the kind of design, both are sort of a mainstream or a casual audience focus. Take the Gold is a very light take that game that features adorable animal art, so cat pirates and corgi officers and other characters like that. And it's a very lightweight take that game that's geared toward ages 7+, although I've had as young as 4-year-olds playing it. It works really well as a kind of a filler game or a warm-up while you're waiting for people to come together for game night. So that's all poker cards, 54-card deck with a number of different functional action cards. Department of Spin fits more into the party game or social game genre. So that's a mix of poker cards and minis, but again, a card-based game. And that's more of a prompt-driven sort of storytelling and improv game where the players are part of the White House press secretary's crisis management team, if you will. And their role is to try and find the best positive spin for various absurd scandals taking place in the fictional White House that the game focuses on. So they're taking a hand of issue cards, real-life issues like the economy and coal miners and things like that, and they're trying to create a story or an improvisation that ties that issue into an absurd scandal that a judge reads. So again, they're very much a party kind of game where you're getting to improvise or create your own story to kind of fill in the gaps, and then the judge decides which one they find best.
Okay, cool. And the kind of like story-driven design. I had a contact on mine from a few years ago, Corvus Elrod, who I know has done like storytelling in the past. Have you ever heard of him?
I think I've heard the name, yeah.
Yeah, I know his game, I think it was Zakaro, or he created like some kind of like a narrative storytelling engine. This was, oh man, I can't even remember. It's been at least 4 or 5 years at this point, which is about like 2 decades in game design speak. Now, I guess with your games at Strife Games, like, have you guys worked on games previous before forming Strife?
I don't think we've really worked. I guess I take that back. So we worked on a number of sort of half-baked ideas, sitting around and kind of putting together some basic mechanics and things. Never really went beyond that prior to Take the Gold. So in terms of creating games for publication and for a wider audience, probably a relatively recent thing for us. We were more gamers in terms of playing games more than creating them up until relatively recently.
Yeah, it's one of those things where we've definitely played board games for a long time, and well, video games too. But in terms of making them, there were ideas, definitely there were mechanics being tested. I think that's as far as we can. Mike had that really cool game for a little while that just but there was never really a drive to kind of put it out in the world. It was just more of a hobby thing, and then you came up with Take the Gold, and that just kind of hit a nice spot, I think, in terms of kind of like playability, usability, accessibility, and just being a fun game. So then after that, we kind of made this game as a group. So that's kind of the more or less our game making history.
And I don't know how far you want to go off the rails with storytelling. In terms of Take the Gold, it actually wasn't a game I'd intended to design originally. So it was a derivative of a game I'd been working on for about a year prior to that, which was my first attempt at a full-fledged tabletop game, also fully card-based, but a lot more sophisticated in terms of mechanics. It was a game called, that I might make someday. So the tentative name of it's Everyday Strife. But that game that project's been shelved. Basically, what happened with that was, in the course of making this ridiculous game with 300 plus individual, every card was unique and functional. It wasn't like a TCG or something. I was trying to find a way to blend some of the TCG-esque elements in terms of some of the ways you line up a tableau and combat other players, but trying to bring that into almost a party or a casual game audience. And in the course of doing that, I thought I had some issues of balancing different ways the cards interacted. So I distilled that into a set of just a handful of action cards and was trying to find the right proportion for a deck. And in the course of testing that sort of test deck, that mechanic test deck, everyone who played this other game that was this derivative experimental deck was saying, this is a great game, you should make this game instead. And I was convinced. I was like, no, I'm going to make Everyday Strife. That's the game I'm working on. This is just a tester. And so after some time, I got my head out of the sand and realized, okay, everyone's asking for this other game. Maybe that's the one I should be working on. So that then became Take the Gold, ultimately. There's a whole bunch of stories around that. I guess it might not be related to what we're here to talk about tonight. But and then beyond that, I was thinking back. I'm kind of shaking the dust off the memory here. But I did work with a few friends on a mobile game previously, unrelated to stuff we're doing at Strife, not a tabletop game, but something for the iPhone, an educational game for kids that unfortunately the project kind of just sort of fizzled out, didn't quite make it across the finish line, as we had people, it was sort of a summertime project, and then people were going back to school and doing different things, and we didn't end up quite getting it across the finish line. So a number of sort of half-baked things, and then more recently Take the Gold, Department of Spin being the finished games.
Yeah. And with both Take the Gold and Department of Spin, as you said, they're both aimed more towards like the casual or first-time players. Do you guys see yourself like working on games aimed more at core or hardcore players, or do you prefer, I guess, this kind of audience for your kind of designs?
I think short answer is absolutely. Most of the games that we enjoy tend to be more involved. So it's not like we love just kind of casual games, if you want to call them that, just lighter games. They're nice, they're fun, they always have a place, especially if you only have a limited amount of time, or you're not really into spending the next 3 hours trying to set up a board and then playing it afterwards. It's always great to have those quick games, those easy games that you can get into. So, but in terms of would we make more complex games? Yes, easy yes.
Yeah,
there's plenty of ideas out there. It's just a matter of getting those made. But those do tend to be a lot more involved in mechanics. They tend to be a lot more complicated, and it takes a lot more development time and a lot more effort to get the balance right. And depending on whatever mechanic you're trying to use, try and maximize that while still keeping it fresh and new, so that people don't feel like they've played the same game before. So, yeah. Short answer, long answer.
Yeah, I definitely would second that. Short answer, yes, and to have your games. Part of the idea was starting off with lighter things as developers and as designers. I'm not sure if you mind me plugging other podcasts potentially, because I wanted to kind of quote one here, but Is that all
Go
right?
ahead. Yeah.
Okay. There's a great podcast called the Board Game Business Podcast. It's Richard New, Brian Hank, and I think Jeremy Commander's on there as well. Richard and Brian are part of, or I guess they're the principals on Overworld Games. If I'm remembering the name correctly, I always mix up my publishers and my actual designer name. But one of the great pieces of advice they gave in one of their episodes was that as a new designer, one of the things you oftentimes want to look to do, you may have these grandiose ideas of great, your medium heavy or ultra heavy Euro or something that you want to start out with. It's oftentimes a good idea for the sake of learning the process to come up with what's the smallest game you can make, the smallest, lightest game you can make, something that fits in 54 cards or even 18 card micro, just something that allows you to go through the process of designing, testing, seeking a publisher or seeking art and self-publication, depending on your preferences, just really getting a hang of it, which even the game I mentioned, Everyday Strife, that was like a 300 card, still pure poker cards, no other components. Even that was probably heavy for me, at least, to tackle as a person with a full-time job, designing on the side. So trying to jump even into that deep of an end, I found that doing Take the Gold was a great way to learn the ropes and create a game that went on to succeed without necessarily having to embrace the lengthy, heavy-duty process of designing for that hardcore audience. There's definitely a lot of considerations that I'm sure we'll talk about tonight involved in doing that.
Yep, and I've heard similar opinions and that kind of methodology among indie developers going into making their first full video game. Because, again, that's something that definitely applies to both ends of the spectrum. Because we've seen developers, especially like I have from the independent scene, who they'll go all in on their first game without any prior experience of working together, without any experience, as you said, with more the management or logistical side of things, and it can become very easy to be overwhelmed when you're compounding that on, as you said, making your grandiose mega idea that you've been preparing for like 10-15 years in your head, and that's going to be your very first game before you've even touched a game engine before.
Yeah, that can be it's a serious undertaking is what it comes down to. And especially when you realize that on the back end of that, let's say you go the Kickstarter route, you fund, and now you've got to deliver that. And regardless of the printing quotes you've got, regardless of the assurances you have from vendors, there's going to be hiccups. So, of course, the more moving parts, whether that's figuratively speaking through logistics or literally speaking with bits and bobs in the box, you're going to have difficulties along the way. So starting with delivering 54 cards is a way more manageable thing to do rather than trying to do a heavy game in the literal sense of a box full of stuff, as well as the figurative sense of all the different mechanics and things you need to test.
Yeah, and I've talked to a few tabletop designers in the past, including Sandy Pearson from Pearson Games, as well as his son. We talked about, again, there's all these little factors that can easily add up to sink a project, especially, as you just said, Ali, going the Kickstarter route, when all of a sudden you now have, tens of hundreds or hundreds of thousands of people expecting a product, expecting physical goods, getting them all shipped, getting them all manufactured. And it is easier to start out with a smaller project when there's less balls to juggle, rather than, again, trying to go all in. And this is, I think, one of the reasons why we've seen, at least from the Kickstarter side, that the Kickstarters that tend to have succeeded have come from people who've had that kind of experience before. That they've started out with something small, and then they save their big idea now that they know what they're doing. Or we've even seen developers who have kind of embraced Kickstarter as their full finance option, that they will just kickstart each one of their games, and each one of their Kickstarters just gets better and better because they're more accustomed to that platform.
Mm-hmm. And even if you're not going the Kickstarter route, so if you're looking at pitching a game to a publisher, as a first timer or as a relatively new designer, you're putting together a sell sheet perhaps, or you're putting together your pitch. When you come to a publisher as a relative unknown and they're looking at the game, they're not just looking necessarily at the theme that you're pitching or the mechanics or who you are as a designer and the audience you may bring, but they are also looking at things like component count. So if they're already having to sort of check all these other boxes on you in terms of are you a feasible investment of their time and their energy, if you are also bringing them a game that is ultra heavy, that has all these different components, that's just another factor. It's not necessarily something that'll turn them off completely or detract, and I'm not a large publisher myself, so obviously can't speak to their every thought, but that's one thing that I've noticed in talking to others and talking to publishers is that component count, of course, is very important to determining what's this game going to cost in terms of R&D and then ultimate fulfillment. And then, of course, the further up that price point goes, the more you're asking from an audience in terms of investing in a new designer. So that's another reason, even if you're not going the Kickstarter route, you're going traditional publishing, to bear in mind that a lighter game is going to be easier to place probably as a first timer.
Definitely. And we can easily segue into talking more about that kind of production and the Kickstarter as well. But I guess here's a question for both of you. Obviously, as we've said, Take the Gold and now Department of Spin have been your Kickstarter or your crowdfunding. Have you guys did crowdfunding previously, or was like Take the Gold like your first step into that kind of territory?
No, I don't think any of us did any kind of crowdfunding before. We've done some events where we raised money for a local hospital. So we played. There was I think this was last year, if I remember right. We did like a 24-hour board game event where we essentially played. I don't even remember how many games over a course of 24 hours on webcam and everything. And then we raised a few $1,000s for the local children's hospital. So that is probably the only kind of event, kind of fundraising event that we've had. We've had a couple of fundraising events in our group of friends here. But in terms of funding an actual project, as far as I know, Take the Gold was the first that any of us had any experience with.
Yeah, which I guess actually two good plugs to make there. One was the charity event was for Extra Life, which is an awesome cause, really big with video gaming, and they're getting more into tabletop, which is what we did, a 24-hour tabletop fun, which is if you ever want to know for sure whether your friends are friends for life, try playing 24 hours of tabletop games in the non-air conditioned back room of a generous local game store that hosted us. But just a real test of friendship. But I think we're all still talking. So I think it went okay.
We're still good.
But the second plug I want to make was on Take the Gold. I actually I designed that game, but I placed it with another publisher. As my first time out, I didn't want to take any chances with even remotely attempting that myself. So I do want to plug for Card Lords, who published that. They've got several great games out, and Take the Gold is one of them under their label. So could not have done it without them in terms of just I think the level of success that we had. It was a great learning experience as well, working with someone who's had that success on Kickstarter previously. So just want to make sure I got that out there, got credit is due.
Nice. So I guess here's a question that I like to ask all the developers who we've had on who've had like crowdfunding or have done the Kickstarter route. I guess what were your thoughts on doing this? Because I know for a lot of developers, it's still considered this very strange thing of doing a Kickstarter as opposed to a traditional publisher-funded game.
Well, I mean, I could do long answer, short answer. I don't know if you want to tackle that one first.
Sure. I'll give my side of the story, I guess. With Department of Spin, we did have this conversation pretty early on, saying, how do we want to approach this? Because there's different. Obviously, we could do it all ourselves, which means that we are now responsible for everything, or we can try and find a publisher who will then take up a lot of that responsibility in terms of marketing, in terms of funding, in terms of all of that stuff. But then we would lose a lot of, potentially lose some of the control over the game. And I don't know, all three of us really felt really strongly about the game itself. We thought the game itself was pretty good. It's a lot of fun. It's, I think the simplicity of it also just sort of, we didn't have that huge box to deal with, where we would now have to deal with maybe 30, 40 pieces of art that needs to be done for each individual piece, for each individual card, or however many pieces we end up having with a big game. We only had a limited amount of art that we needed. The box, as long as it holds cards, doesn't need to be complex at all. Things like that, just the complexity of and just our feelings on the game itself. We decided to kind of just do it ourselves instead, and so we put up all of the money ourselves up front that we could in terms of making the game, and then in terms of getting it published, Unfortunately, we kind of ran out of money on that, so that's why we went to Kickstarter, because we do need some help getting that the bulk orders, getting the game out in the world.
Yeah, I think, Mirko, you hit it on the head. The main thing with that is that, in my opinion, from a design perspective, is you get maximum creative control of the project, which isn't always the best thing in the sense of you do miss out on the publisher and the development role that a publisher has. Oftentimes a publisher comes to you or gets involved with a game that is, they expect you to have developed and tested it to the first extent you have as a designer, but they may bring in, of course, further development, rules tweaks, things like that. In the case of Department of Spin, rules are very straightforward as a social or party game. So the main thing for us, I think, was ownership of the content, was making sure that the jokes in the game basically were things that we put in that part of ourselves in the game, and we didn't necessarily want to compromise on that vision with the publisher, who might want to eliminate things they may have seen as off color or something like that. So it was one of the reasons we opted to go that route. The other was that it was a game that we felt, from a logistics and fulfillment standpoint, we could manage, being that it's pure cards, so simple components meant that we were able to go out and get our quotes and really nail down what our production costs would be. We wouldn't have to worry about minis and doing casts or molds and things like that. Shipping was fairly straightforward in terms of cost management and all that. So just a more manageable way to enter that Kickstarter sort of market and make that attempt. One of the other trade-offs is, as much as we do bear costs up front in terms of art and things, I'd say overall the cost to yourself may not be quite as high as if you try to go completely end-to-end without Kickstarter at all, obviously. If you're trying to do all the printing and then sell it directly into retail or distribution, you're definitely going to have a better route using Kickstarter to offset that cost. I guess that would be almost what I'd call the traditional use of Kickstarter. But then there is the aspect of, we've seen it increasingly shift toward big names still using it. It's not necessarily for funding that dream anymore. It's becoming, to borrow a Richard Bliss podcast title, it's more about a pre-order system for a lot of people. Many people, if you look at the Kickstarter board game groups and Facebook and things, their comments are they want to see finished games. They're not always looking to back somebody that they don't already know, because there's sort of not a risk, I want to say, necessarily they take. I mean, there's a bit of one, really. You're investing your trust in someone to deliver on a project that you're backing. But increasingly, it seems like there are bigger and bigger names, and you do see those breakout hits, those previously unknown people in game design coming up to the fore. And then you look back, and then that kind of takes you to the crux of Kickstarter, is that they were successful in other areas, brought a crowd with them. They were artists, or they productized something else, and they bring that crowd to a Kickstarter and say, hey, let's gamify my comic or my unicorn art or whatever. Hint hint. And it all looks good. I'm just saying that that's the instrumental thing with Kickstarter, is it's a fantastic platform, but it's not there to make you visible. Yes. You bring the crowd with you. They make you more visible, and you explode from there. But you definitely, crowdfunding is, as many others have put it before, it's all about you bringing the crowd. Going with a traditional publisher, they're definitely going to help you do that. But of course, you've got to sell your game to them. You've got to weather the likely creative changes, theme changes, all that kind of thing. And then they may also, especially if they're a larger publisher, they may say, hey, we love your game. We can't wait to get it out there. But we are going to wait 18 months, really, because we've got a pipeline a mile long of games we're already publishing. So that's one of the other big trade-offs, is how quickly do you want to see it potentially happen.
And as you said, one of the biggest points, especially a major lesson for new developers who are trying to do Kickstarter, as you said, you have to have an audience. You can't, the days of you just showing up on Kickstarter and saying, I have an idea, give me $100,000, that's not going to happen anymore. And I've spoken to developers and people who've worked on Kickstarter projects in the past, especially Chris Barassa from Red Hook Games, who did The Darkest Dungeon. And when I talked to him, he said that they did a good year to year and a half of preparing for that Kickstarter, between building a fan base, letting people know about the game, doing promotional art, videos, and whatnot. So that, as you said, when they launched that Kickstarter, they already had people who were fully well knew about that game, and of course ready to let other people know about it. I mean, the only reason I know about The Darkest Dungeon was because one of my friends was following that game for the last, I think, year beforehand. He said, hey, there's this really kooky Lovecraft game on Kickstarter, you should check it out. I'm like, oh, no, Now I gotta give them money. Thanks a lot. It looks so cool here. Just take my wallet. There we go. But again, like the marketing side thing has definitely been a very underappreciated and very much an underutilized part for a lot of first-time developers, and it can sometimes be a trap that they can fall into with not doing that kind of work. Especially, I guess here's somewhat of a segue of a question for two of you, but in terms of like visibility or discoverability, how is it in the tabletop market? Because from my experience of talking to independent developers, I know it's very tricky on this side of things.
Mm-hmm. Well, do you want to field the visibility?
No, you go for it.
Okay, can do. So I guess I'll use kind of two examples. I think we're not too shy about kind of our current campaign and experience with that and all that. I'll dial it back a little bit to take the gold. Working with Card Lords 1, they had a baked-in audience that was very aligned with that same game type and theme and everything. So that obviously helps a lot. And that was something they built by going to cons and by networking. With tabletop, I think because you can't necessarily, and I'll correct myself on this in a second, but off the cuff, you don't typically have a link you can send someone where they can experience the game. They can't necessarily just jump into a web page and get the full experience of playing it. That can cut both ways, because I think you have a number of very successful games, tabletop games, that once people play them, they go, okay, that was cool. Was it worth $60? I don't know. But the marketing, the hype, got them in the door. On the flip side, you have fantastic games with hours upon hours of replayability that you can't get that experience from just an artistic image or something like that. That being said, you have things like print and place, you've got Tabletop Simulator, you've got a lot of utilities out there, a lot of vehicles for getting that game experience in the hands of players. But I would say, speaking to myself mostly, I'm terrible with social media, so I'm not great at networking virtually. I'm very much a face-to-face kind of person. So I love going to cons, sitting down, playing games with people. And that, to me, I think is where tabletop really delivers, both as a general gaming experience, but also from the standpoint of marketing a game, is being able to get people at that table when you've got a game that you've really tightened up. You've got a solid game experience where they're going to play it and not just be like, great, I played it, I've had that experience, but when they want to play again, that's when you've created something that really delivers an audience to you for your eventual Kickstarter or publication. So I think that's one of the better approaches, is trying to get as much face time with people. That is local game nights at your friendly local game store. That's hosting game nights through Meetup and things like that. Going to cons, putting out a petition to your friends to see if you can get playtesters, but it has to get beyond your existing reach. It can't just be the people that have played that game 100 times because they're your friend and they put up with you. So you've got to have more of the general public strangers playing your game, both from a playtesting standpoint, of course, as well as from the marketing standpoint, getting outside of your existing circles.
Mm-hmm. And the same can certainly be said on the independent side when it comes to video games as well, because we've seen developers who tend to just enclose themselves in their own personal echo chamber, and then they take it out to a con or to a local game night, and everyone's like, I don't like this game, or could you change this? And they're like, well, I think it's perfectly fine. It must be something on your end, or it's your fault that this game isn't working. And again, we have seen many developers, especially first-timers, tend to struggle with that social and the marketing side of games. And as you said, especially when it comes to the tabletop, it's a different experience. You're not, as you said, you're not going to be sending this to some random person on another con, and you're going to be sometimes standing right in front of them face to face while they're playing your game for the first time, or just watching a group of people from a distance, taking apart your game and seeing, are they playing it right? Should I, jump in? Should I try and correct them if they have something wrong? Stuff along those lines.
Yeah. Actually, on the video gaming and to maybe a lesser degree tabletop, a little plug again for Playcrafting, which is a group. We did a couple of events with them where they do them, I think, in New York City as well as here in SF. They'll do an evening where they bring local indie developers, by and large video game developers. So for your video game viewer, audience members here for this, definitely something to check out, because they're a great opportunity to go out, and they do a great job of setting up a venue. So if you're in San Francisco or the New York City area, Playcrafting is something to look into for another venue to bring your game to a public audience, as opposed to trying to share links online. You can bring your hardware, set up among 30, 40, 50 other indie designers, and network with other designers, but also they'll bring a public audience to you in the form of free pizza and a ticketed event to bring people in to get your game tested and get the word out. So Playcrafting is a great resource for digital gaming and as well as analog, which is more our focus.
Yeah.
For those of you watching live, I just try to post a link to the Kickstarter. I think YouTube's chat's being very annoyed about links right now. So if you want links to those, I will be including those in the descriptions below for those of you watching this recorded. But getting back to the topic, I guess here's a question we probably should have talked about before. This should either be a very long or a very short answer, depending on the two of you. But I guess what attracted you, I guess, including the third person. What's his name again for people watching?
Mike Cullen.
Mike, what attracted the three of you to working on tabletop games? Like, what aspects did you particularly like that kind of inspired you to go out and try and create your own?
I don't know if I can speak for all of us individually, but I can speak for myself at least. I know that I've been playing board games, tabletop games for a long time. There was already a connection there, so I like those kinds of games. So now having no artistic ability or any kind of programming ability of my own, I couldn't exactly go into making video game as much as I'd like to at some point. You had some ideas and things like that. My own abilities don't lend me to that, but creating ideas and mechanics and things like that, you can do that with board games or tabletop games. So it's a lot easier that way. So of course, even if I had the artistic ability, which I don't, I would have still...
It's nonsense.
Well, I can draw some stick figures.
I've seen your paint work. It's nice.
You can.
Yes,
I think you beat me in terms of stick figure. We had like a little stick figure fight. I think you'll probably beat me in the art side.
I don't know. We can have that fight another day, but yeah, just in terms of the accessibility, in terms of making that kind of game and building it, creating a board game is a lot simpler. There isn't as many skills required. As long as you have an idea, you can try and implement it. Even stick figures, you can test mechanics with just pieces of paper that you just ripped out of a notebook. So I think, at least for me, that was a good place to start. Now, as we mentioned earlier, we would like to make bigger, more complicated games, and there is that always in the back of my head, like, making a video game would be kind of cool too. And there's definitely ideas for that, but small steps. To start somewhere, and board games, card games, easy way to test your prowess, as it were.
Yeah, I think this question is something I could spend an hour easily. Well, you've probably noticed by now I love to talk, so I could go on about any of this. But I guess in short, one of the things I kind of want to echo is I think with tabletop, there's definitely a high level of skill required, a lot of vision, and like writing tight rules. Like you don't get the advantage of relying on a computer to do your math. So you have to find better ways of using your humans at the table to get the engine of the game carried forward as opposed to a computer. But in terms of technical skills, that's kind of what I ran into. I'd mentioned at the beginning that I worked on a mobile game for a while with a few friends, and so trying to bring artists and programmers and designers together and deliver that project. That was one of the struggles I'd run into with that, was that I wasn't a programmer or an artist. I was the designer, and then trying to also like herd the cats and like project manage the thing. And so after that project, when everybody had gone their separate ways, as we approached the finish line and school and life called and everybody kind of split up, I sat there thinking, well, I still want to make games, but I don't necessarily have time to learn how to program. So that was what brought me back into tabletop. But I'd started out, I think I was the filthiest of casuals in terms of my tabletop upbringing, because my family played games, but they were the Monopolies and the Saris of the world. So I didn't get to kind of experience the glory of what tabletop has become until probably the last 5 or 6 years maybe, when, and of all the things, I'm sure there are people listening, like hardcore tabletop gamers there, and it hurts me to say this too, but it was like Flux and Munchkin that brought me back into tabletop, which I know are like, a lot of people say, oh, Flux, like the game that never ends. But But anyway, sitting down to that and going, wow, there's more than Monopoly. That was my wake up moment of, gee, maybe I should look at this more. And so I kind of filed that away. And then after the mobile game kind of petered out, I was like, well, I still want to make games. I find myself loving all these different tabletop games now. So I need to look more into this and learn more about all the possibilities. And that just means playing a ton of tabletop games. So that was kind of my deliverance from, I did a lot of video gaming. I really don't anymore. I can't seem to find the time. Like when I have the time to game, I like it as a social experience with people sitting with me, because like I mentioned, I'm a face-to-face kind of person. So as much as you can have a social experience with video games, I found that most of the time I was playing Counter-Strike and flaming people. So I was better off sitting at a table with other people and having that face-to-face experience. That was what really brought me back into tabletop as a hobby, is playing it, and that naturally dovetailed with what I was looking to do in terms of creating games. So that was kind of my experience. And as for Mike's answer to that question, I think he's a bigger gamer than probably, I mean, at least than me in terms of just the sheer volume of games he plays. Yeah. So I would say if he was had the time to be with us here, he'd probably be saying the same thing, which is that it's a love of games, playing them, that brings around in tabletop. That I think that's something Mike and I have talked about a little bit, actually, is that face-to-face interaction. It creates a different dynamic than when you're behind a screen.
Mm-hmm. As I mentioned, Mike has made his own game before this. It never saw completion, but
it hasn't yet.
Not yet. we're trying to get him to bring it back. But in terms of card games, I don't know how his approach is, but he's definitely always had that creative side of him as well. So it was just sort of a happenstance that we decided one night, got together, and just sort of like, let's see if we can just throw ideas out and see if anything sticks. And then all of a sudden we got Department of Spin. So
awesome. All right. To do a quick time check, I know we're about going on like 45 minutes in, so I figure we'll talk, I guess, before we get to our big topic regarding testing or designing game meant for the casual audience. Are there any specific areas of like Kickstarter or tabletop development that we didn't touch on that either of you would like to discuss now?
I guess it depends. There's a lot to talk about in that realm. Probably the biggest, I think the best thing I can do is actually plug for a couple blogs. Jamie Stegmeyer and James Matthew both have excellent blogs that cover anything I could possibly speak to. They cover with 10 to 100 to 1,000 times the depth of insight and wisdom. So I can recommend those right off the cuff. But yeah, I think that's the first thing I'd say in terms of just in the interest of time. Otherwise, I could ramble all night long about Kickstarter theory and practice and what I've learned along the way just in my relatively brief time pursuing this. So I'll spare you that unless you have specific questions about it.
Actually, I think I do. This will, I think, be very informative for any new developers watching. I guess for both of you, has there been like any aspect when it came to designing or like the full process of creating your tabletop game that kind of like hit you from out of right field? You know, something that hindsight, being 2020 and all that, that would be like a pretty big red flag for like a new developer who wanted to get into the market to either avoid or pay closer attention to?
Probably a few. I think the biggest thing in terms of the Kickstarter page itself and kind of getting it up there, I think the biggest thing is, for me at least, in terms of actually being completely involved in that process for the first time with Department of Spin, just how much work and preparation it takes just to get the page itself set up before it even goes live. Mm-hmm. I figured, it'd be relatively simple, create a web page, how bad can it be? But it really, the amount of work that it requires just to get the page set up, get everything right in there, get all the appropriate information in there, and that caught me by surprise. I wasn't expecting, Ali. I think you tried to warn us before, but it's one of those things that I didn't expect. But definitely hindsight being 2020 as it is, would have personally planned a longer time allotment to just figuring out the site and making sure that all works well in advance before even actually getting close to hitting that button to make it go live.
Yeah, there's a lot of things to touch on there, but I think I'll kind of echo that a little bit. The game is definitely the thing, and anybody can make a game. The challenge is if you decide you want to take that beyond your kitchen table, you want to go beyond your circle of friends and your local game night, and you want to bring a game into the world, you become a business person the moment you decide to do that. It doesn't matter if you're going to a publisher, or you're going to self-publish by paying to print it, or you're going to self-publish through crowdfunding to get it paid, to get the factory paid and get it printed that way. You're running a business. That means you're pitching publishers or you're pitching people. You're contacting printers for quotes and then finding out how to map that into a crowdfunding goal, or you're just paying that from your second mortgage or whatever it is you're wanting to do. But the best thing to keep in mind with that when you're going in that business is, above all else, people matter. People are your players, people are your testers, people may be your co-designers or artists, they may be the person to publish it and of course to fund it. So whether that's funding and crowdfunding, or whether that's buying the games from you after the fact and getting you paid back for your printing investment. So it doesn't matter, and I think actually John had talked about this in your playtesting conversation previously. You don't want to wait till you have a game that is as close to done as you can take it. From the first moment that you have something that's playable, it's time to start showing people, and it's time to engage with your local designer community, because they'll understand, maybe not necessarily the broader public from day one, but very quickly you want to be out there with two things in hand, or three things really. One is an open mind, be prepared to take feedback and work with it. Two is a functional prototype of some sort. It doesn't have to be your final vision, just anything that shows the core experience of your game. And three is a sheet of paper to take down email addresses. Because from minute one, you want to be establishing those relationships with people. Say, okay, you liked the game, or maybe you found it was horribly broken, but you're interested enough in it to follow along. Hey, let me get your email address, and I'll keep you up to date in my newsletter or whatever. And you want to make, you don't just want to look at people's vending machines for feedback. You want to engage with them as well. But keeping that contact so important, because by the time you get to the Kickstarter campaign, now maybe, or GoFundMe if you're doing that, or whatever end result, even if it's with another publisher doing that side of it for you, you're going to have an opportunity to reach out to all those people and say, hey, the game's in retail, or the game is on Kickstarter, or I am kickstarting the game. And you can go all the way back to the beginning. So the sooner that you start engaging with the public, the better off you're going to be in terms of getting the game tested and working the way you ultimately want it to, but also getting the game actually funded or published. So that would probably be my number one advice, is just engaging with people as quickly as possible, and having a business mindset where possible. That's a skill set. I think there are a lot of great game designers out there that their games may never see the light of day, but those that want to take them to the world, they have to make sure that they kind of flip that switch into business mode, at least as far as, at a minimum, pitching publishers, if not going all the way through the crowdfunding process.
Yeah. And to add on to your tip there, Alia, is another major part. Don't wait until a month before your game comes out before you do any kind of advertising or start sending emails out to people. But yeah, completely agree with you on that. And if speaking to many independent developers and kind of watching things from this side, we have certainly seen many developers struggle with, again, balancing the businessman and the artist. And that is easily like an hour and a half discussion if we get too far into that. But as you said, it's very important to start looking at things basically from day one. Like the second you start thinking about, I want to sell this game to someone, you have to start putting together kind of like that business mindset. And it goes beyond just, again, emailing someone once every 3 to 6 months or making a blog update every 5 weeks. It's something you have to do continually, because that's the only way it's going to get out there.
No, absolutely.
Yeah.
You have to be constantly visible, because you're trying to stand out above, 200 to 300 tabletop games alone going on Kickstarter every month. You've got to have a way to stand out and get people's attention. And you can't do that if you just sneak out of the shadows once every 6 months and say, oh yeah, I'm still alive and I'm working on a game. That isn't going to cut it. If you think about how often, even if you're a religious Facebook user, you're still missing posts, let alone if you're the average person checking it once or twice a day. So if I'm posting once a day about my game, odds are just in my immediate circle of people, I'm missing the vast majority of my crowd, let alone in the broader sense.
Yeah, definitely. And again, these are topics we could spend a few hours on like it's nothing. I mean, we got John here. We'll be here probably until next week sometime if we get all of us talking. But let's move on to our big topic. And for anyone watching this live, if you have any questions or would like to chime in, definitely feel free to leave a question in the old chat box over there. But our main topic is going to be talking about the challenge of creating a casual game, or creating games that aren't aimed at someone who's had, dozens if not hundreds of hours of experience with your respective genre. And like we said, even though we're going to be talking about things from a tabletop standpoint, there are definitely parallels to it when it comes to playtesting an independent game or just a video game in general. So, I guess to begin with, for you guys, obviously with your background with design like a tabletop, how do you start approaching things when you're realizing that the people you're going to pitch this game to or show it to have never played a tabletop game before in their lives? Like, what goes through your mind or your development process when you're starting out like that?
You want to take that?
I'd love to. So I guess the first thing that kind of enters your mind is if you have someone who's literally never played a tabletop game before, whereas those of us who are accustomed to tabletop or love tabletop games, we love to see a big old spread of components on that table. Boards, cards, chits, meeples, minis, as detailed as possible. We just want to see as much game stuff as possible. And that's been I think, a driving factor of the success of many Kickstarter campaigns is you set a picture of the game and there's just a ton of components, and that's instant value. You're instantly thinking, wow, all that for only $60? Hell yes. So a casual is going to come up and they're going to walk by it, and this is what happens frequently. Like we had this at PAX a couple weeks ago, which is where it's a largely video game, I'd say, audience, but there's tabletop going on, and you'll have people walk by and they'll poke their heads in the room and they'll see there's people in this strange room playing. They're not in front of screens at all. They're sitting there with cards.
What is this strange thing?
Yes, and then you look at him and say, "Why, good sir, this is analog gaming. Step right into our mysterious tent here." And so when they poke their heads and they see someone playing Terraforming Mars, they have a moment of like, "Oh God, like what is this?" And what is this dark ritual I'm witnessing? So especially when you're designing for a casual audience, like if you're thinking, I guess I'll put it this way. I think it's a dream of most every game designer to make that mainstream hit that just blows up. And so then they turn around and say, well, I'm also building a medium-heavy Euro that has, it's 2 to 3 hours of gameplay with like 40 different scoring mechanisms. And so it's like, okay, you got to line up. If you want to attack that mainstream audience, you probably shouldn't be building Shakespeare. Like you should probably think about, targeting your audience. My day job's sales, so it's something I think about all the time is, lining that stuff up. But anyway, the gist of it is, if you're going with that casual audience or if you want to draw them in, it's got to look easy. Even if it doesn't necessarily have to look, I guess I'll take it back, not easy in terms of the winning the game, so to speak, but easy enough to learn and accessible. That's probably the word I should have used there. At least look very accessible. So when people see cards in a hand and maybe a little pickup or like a draw pile and discard pile, they're thinking, okay, I've played Uno. They've had to have seen, unless they've literally just walked out of a cave that they've been in for their entire lives, they've probably seen Uno or they've seen blackjack or they've seen something involving poker cards, and so they have something, they have some hook, they have something to latch onto. So using that, putting that forward. So even if you want to bring in sophisticated mechanics, you can do lots with just plain old poker cards. Having that visual, having bright, attractive art on your cards, having big, easy to understand symbols and numbers, just those things that give someone something they can fixate their eyes on without just their eyes glazing over. If you bring a casual into, and I use Magic, it's probably not the best example to use because pretty much everyone's seen Magic at this point. But if a person who's never played a tabletop game before looks at a Magic card, especially one of the rarer ones, they're going to get probably a little confused by what they're looking at, and that instantly creates a gap for them. It creates a deterrent from sitting down and even trying the game. You have to make them able to believe that they can play, not that they can win necessarily, but just that their time investment is not going to be so significant that it overwhelms the reward they're going to get from the gaming experience. So and I think that's, for example, I mean, just a cliche at this point to point to, like Cards Against Humanity, the accessibility is apparent. There are no symbols, no numbers. You have a monochrome card with some some large text, easy to read, and there's virtually no hang up in terms of what do I do with this. So that's like the ultimate casual, in terms of accessibility. but that lesson stands in terms of translating that into heavier card games and things, finding those ways of overcoming the initial player objection to this isn't going to do the thinking for me, I have to do things. Well, it's okay, you can read the cards, you can start to figure this out. So that would probably be the first thing that comes to mind in answering that question.
Yeah, I basically kind of have to echo that, because it's the simplicity that's really simplicity and accessibility that's really important in terms of when you're talking about getting people who don't normally play board games, card games, tabletop games of any kind. But I think it's the same for video games as well. It's that accessibility. Like if you're taking a very complex game, like your kind of like a hardcore RPG as an example. Your regular person isn't going to be able to just jump in, who's never played a video game, just jump in and start playing an RPG, because they don't necessarily know what each of the stats are, what they represent, or what they actually do for the game. Why do I need to? I have a piece of armor. Why do I need to get another piece of armor? I already have armor. Like, why do I need a bigger sword? I have a sword. So things like that. I think in the recent years we've seen a huge blow up of just casual games, mobile games, things that have very simple mechanics, and they've taken basically what board games have known for a long, long time, is if you keep your mechanics short, easy to understand, easy to get into, people will, even though don't necessarily play those kinds of games, they'll play it because it's easy. They can get it. And if you have some fancy art on top of that, or if you're a mobile game, you get some cool sounds and some art, and you're set, because it's so accessible. Anyone can just pick it up and play it without having to spend hours trying to learn it, just so they can start playing the game. So, so basically, kind of expanding on that a little bit, but it's that accessibility that's really, really important for getting those players that don't usually play that kind of game.
Yeah, and I agree with you on that, Mirko. Especially, like, I'm not a tabletop player by trade. My friends have been slowly weaning me on with Tabletop Simulator the last year. Like, I just recently played a game, I don't even remember the name of it. I think it was like House on Haunted Hill, or some kind of like horror game.
House on the Hill?
Could be. Again, I'm not... you're talking to the wrong guy about remembering the name. And I remember, like, joining the tabletop session, I'm like, okay, I see this board, that looks good. And then I see this massive, like, stat page of events. I'm like, what the hell is that thing? And then I see, like, over here, there's, like, 5 different decks of cards on the table. I'm like, what the hell did you guys just drag me into with this thing? And
too late, sit down.
Yeah.
You can't leave.
And that's like that challenge again of trying approaching from a casual perspective, because again, if you have that experience, all this looks normal to you. But as you said, like with the PAX example, someone walks in, they see all this stuff laid out, and they'll just like back away slowly, going, "Okay, you guys do that. I'll be over here. I'll be back. Don't worry about it." Now, here's a question from chat that I think is really going from Oscar. Is using some kind of recognizable motifs, like characters, you know, like a mage, sword, wizard, stuff like that, or like having a theme important, or let me see, or themes important, or the interface. Like, I guess is like having something recognizable, like someone can pick up immediately. Does that help to kind of make things more accessible to them?
That's a tough question in terms of choosing between the two. It's a great question, though.
It is, and I think it's not an easy question to answer, because it really depends on what kind of game we're talking about.
Mm-hmm.
If I'm making, as an example, an RPG, if I want to make an RPG, there are certain standards that I want to keep. So you're going to have that kind of interplay. So it is a party-based RPG, as an example. So if as soon as you say that, most people will think of your classic fantasy RPG. So and your D&D clone and clone of a clone, because there's so many of the same ideas. So that immediately will become accessible to people when you just tell them, oh, it's a party-based RPG. They know what to expect. But if you're focusing on, oh, it's this really cool game that looks really cool and it's got, all these different races that no one's ever heard of, but you omit telling them it's a party-based RPG and you're focusing on the aesthetics of it, you're more likely to confuse people at that point, if that makes sense. But if you're talking about something more simple, like a mobile game, as an example, a look can go a long, long way, because if you're keeping those mechanics very simple, if the game looks really attractive, that can be your selling point, and then you can teach them the skills necessary to play those games simply, easily, quickly. That will go a long way. So either one, I guess, it really depends on the type of game that you're kind of making, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and you kind of, I know, like from the independent side, you also worry about kind of like bearing the lead in a matter of speaking by like approaching or advertising your game as being an RPG, but then you leave out, let's say, roguelike elements, or you're kind of marketing it the wrong way. To give you an example of that, I've spoken to game designer Jake Burgett, who's made casual games such as Regency Solitaire and a few other ones. He's right now working on the game Shadowhand, and he talked about how he had to try and market these games differently depending upon who he was aiming for. Like with Regency Solitaire being more of a casual experience, he played up, the pick up and play aspect of this game more when he was advertising it on the various like Big Fish games or like the casual ports like that. But with Shadowhand being more of a traditional game or more on the RPG side, he told me he's trying to make it more, I guess, quote unquote, Steam friendly. Like he's going to really play up the RPG side. You're going to get into these battles and level your character up. And it is very important, not just with a casual, but again with your core audience, in terms of how's the best way to present this game to someone. And I think that takes you to a very interesting point. I think one of the major, dividing lines between tabletop and video game, especially in this kind of discussion, when we're talking about a tabletop experience, at least as you guys are talking about when you're presenting it to new people, you're showing it at a con, there is someone there who knows what's going on. You're going to have the game master, the person who's going to run things, who can teach new players about it. But when it comes to the video game side, when you're selling your game to someone, you're not going to be in that room with them to tell them what's going on. You have to design a tutorial or some kind of guide for them on that front. So I guess keeping with that line, when it comes to the tabletop side, like when you have someone come in who's going to play your game, again, someone like right off the streets, they've never heard of you before, they've never seen your game, how do you, I guess, sit them down and try to explain to them, what it is I'm looking at here?
That's the most fun part of the process, of course, more fun than playing the game. Actually, I want to. This kind of ties back into Oscar's question a little bit. I was just going to say that to sort of echo what Mirko said, but to add on to that, theme and that like the recognizable motifs. And I tend to start a design from theme. It's something I'm trying to break myself of, because I personally believe that like truly good games start in mechanics and you find a theme that fits. But I love to think of stories and characters first, and then fit mechanics and gameplay to that. But anyway. Accessible and attractive theme is your initial hook to get someone to pay any attention to the game at all, and then interface and usability, so to speak, of the game is what gets them to go from that excitement into actually playing or investing in your game. So they're both important. I would say if you had to pick one, I guess it would be theme, because you're never going to get anywhere if people aren't even looking at your game, and theme is usually one of the first things that they latch onto in terms of broad audience. But like Mirko was saying, you got to pair with that. You don't want to tell your audience what they want to hear. You want to make the game they want to play and describe that game well to them. You don't want to find customers for your products. You want to find products for your customers. It's sort of like I guess that's the way that I lean on that. Is you want to actually target the game's going to make the most sense and make sure the game works well for them. So then, in terms of the explaining of a game, so then your question after that, when you sit somebody down, it really does depend on who they are. And in terms of if you're there face to face, you want to, there's a little bit of salesmanship involved. You're wanting to get them to sit down and get them hyped up and excited. If you're, of course, not there, if there's a GM or if they're just buying the game off the shelf, the rules have got to do the talking. There's got to be that quick blurb that gets them invested in the idea, the theme of the game, gets them kind of the mood set for what they're about to play, and then instructions that very clearly communicate with them how to set up. And that's probably the biggest thing for when you're absent, is a setup process that makes sense and that takes them through readily what the game state should look like when they begin the game, how everything should be laid out. When you're present, what I found is great is to do that nice little intro. You kind of get them invested in the theme. And then, if at all possible, like with video games, there's, I guess, the advantage of you have the ability to create a scripted tutorial that takes them through, that pauses gameplay and highlights certain parts of the interface and tells them that this is your mana bar and this is what you click on to bash something. So you have that kind of that setup. You can translate those concepts to games in that you've got your no matter what, whether it's competitive, cooperative, or like a Euro where you're each playing your own game for 3 hours and compare scores, you have sort of that arc of there's a building to a climax and then hopefully resolution that's like right as close to the climax as possible generally. But that rising action gives you an opportunity to have, as opposed to having all the different card piles on the table, maybe the way your game works is round one, there's just the one draw pile and then something happens that causes that to be split in a certain way. So the game state may end up looking like there's so much going on, and that may be, once you're invested in the game, that's the most exciting thing, to see all these moving parts and things happening. But when you first sit down to a game, having it look deceptively simple, that's the magic. Mm-hmm. So being able to say, okay, the board is going to look very simple to begin with, but very quickly things are going to get out of hand. One of the games I love seeing that happen with is called The Captain is Dead, where like you set up the game board and everything is pretty straightforward, and then in real time, like as soon as you start the game, your first set of actions, as opposed to setup being where you do the bad stuff, you establish the bad stuff, setup looks real nice, and then the first round of play, starting with the first player, the bad stuff begins happening to set the game in motion, which is a co-op. You have that ability to kind of script that in a little bit of a structured fashion. But that way, as players, you've already sat down, you've accepted that you're playing this game, you've got your little pawn you've placed in your room, and you've got your limited hand to start with, and you've kind of gotten situated, and then things begin happening, as opposed to sitting down to a game where I've spent 20 minutes setting up. That can be, of course, intimidating for a casual player. So yeah. I think that's a good design approach, is to have the tutorial sort of baked into the initial rising action of the game.
Mm-hmm, yeah. And again, as we said, like that kind of first appearance is very important, especially when you're aiming for an audience who's not very familiar with that game to begin with. Like, from my experience, I usually find that the first 15 to 30 minutes of playing a game is usually that period where I will decide whether or not I'm going to invest more time in it. And if that game annoys me, or I'm confused, or anything bothers me within that time span, I'm generally going to throw that game back into the pool. Like, I'm not going to invest in something that isn't already hooking me. So I guess a question for both of you, when it comes to the tabletop side of things, is there like a general time frame, like in terms of like game tabletop philosophy, like is there like that period of time that you want to keep someone engaged with? Like, again, like I say, when it comes to indie games or traditional video games, it's usually 15 to 30 minutes for me.
Well, again, it kind of depends on what kind of game you're making. If you're making a game for a casual person, something that you plan on being done within less than half an hour, 45 minutes at most. Yeah, obviously you want to make sure you engage the person immediately, and depending on how heavy that game is, you could of course extend that a bit more longer, but it's that immediate hook that that's really necessary. It's also true for bigger games, but the hook could also be that. I'm going to take Risk as an example here, which is controversial, I guess. Some people either love it or hate it. But the idea of Risk, you have that hook, immediate hook of it's world domination. And that's an immediate hook right there. And then the rest of the game looks more or less the same every turn. It's just that you're moving pieces towards that goal of world domination, which you were sold on immediately. So I think in terms of the hook for Risk, at least for me speaking, you tell me it's a world domination game, I'm in. I know what to expect, and I know from experience that these games are not going to be done in a half an hour. We're talking about hours and possibly days before we're done with that game. But having that experience, I know it. For a new person, telling them world domination might be enough, and then 3 hours later they might look at you, go, why were we doing this 3 hours? Nothing has changed on the board. So it really depends on the kind of game, really.
Yeah. I think that Seven Wonders does a really good job with that, both in terms of that rising action I talked about, in terms of it's like letting you in easily. It's not a particularly complex game in terms of numerous mechanisms. It's drafting, some decision making along the way, but what it happens in 3 phases. So that first phase, your set of cards you're drafting from is fairly limited. So for a new player, you're not getting overwhelmed by choices. You have a few choices to make, and they will then affect the game later on in ways that as a first timer you won't understand. But you feel like you're making smart decisions based on some things that are happening, but you're not overwhelmed by it. And then in phases 2 and 3, you're like, okay, I now get how I screwed up going in on military in round 1. So it gives you that ability to get into the game, and then you're ready to play again. You're ready to say, okay, now I get the game. I had a good time, but I know I can do better next time. In terms of the like how quickly you want to have that hook, I think I see Oscar in the chat mentioning the first player or match. That's kind of where I'm at with tabletop. If in the first round of play, if it comes around to my turn again, and I'm not either at least clear on what I should be doing, if not excited to do that thing, you're running a severe risk, especially with a casual player. You're not going to get that second round chance because they've already come back around. They're sitting there staring at the board going, I have no idea what to do. Someone else starts making suggestions. They say, sure, I'll do that. They're not playing anymore. Someone's quarterbacking for them, and they're just kind of going along with it. Unless they're a patient person or they're already an avid tabletop fan, they're probably not going to walk away from that experience saying, yes, I want to play that game again. They're going to think, well, Mirko played it for me. I just kind of sat back and he did the decision making, and I didn't really understand what was going on. So you have that first round. With quick rounds, you'll probably have 2 rounds, whatever that transits to. But I think that it typically is going to transit to a 5 or 10 minute period in a tabletop game where things aren't happening in real time as a typical video game. So you've got less visual stimulus, no sound to speak of except the tabletop. So if you're not stimulating conversation, you've got just that many fewer levers to pull to get a player hooked into your game.
Yeah, I think it's the understanding of the rules within the first 5 or 10 minutes, or just the understanding, not necessarily how to win all the little intricacies, but just having that moment of, okay, I understand how to play this game. So Seven Wonders is a great example of that, where I don't necessarily know what I'm doing, but I understand the concept of this. I'm just going to pick a card and move, pass the rest on, and then at the end I'm going to count up all of the different points that I've managed to accrue, and then usually within 10-15 minutes of that game, it starts clicking, and you're like, oh, if I do this strategy, if I do put these cards together, I'm multiplying everything. So it's that simple concept that then to kind of grasp, but then it's got layers on top of that where you go, yeah, as you're playing, you're learning the game, and you're getting more excited because you got into the game, and then you're getting more and more information to kind of flesh it out. Another game that's, I think, similar in that aspect is like Small World, where it's a really simple concept of take over the board just by moving over things, but then as you're playing it, you're realizing that it's not that simple, and there's a little more layers to it, and there's so much more strategy that you can come up with, but you're already in the game when you're learning these things, so it's fun and you want to learn it.
Let's call that better risk.
Yes. Definitely is.
Now, here's a question, and this one I talked with John about in our last cast. I'm curious what you guys think. But when it comes to having a group of people playing your game, do you typically run playtesting with all casual, all core players, or do you try and mix the 2 groups up?
It depends on the group or the game, I guess. If you're targeting a specific audience, you want to get as much representation from that as possible. And I guess it's okay to work in members of other groups you're not sure about, but throwing a game after a group, I guess I'll use a real life example with Take the Gold. That's a game that I have hardcore players will play it as a filler, but when you're at a con, for example, and you have a group of people passing by and they're carrying, let's say, I don't know, Lords of Waterdeep under one arm and Terraforming Mars on the other or something, I may not call them over to sit down to play a 2 to 6 player ultralight game featuring adorable cats and dogs. Like that might not be the right game to pull them into for a test. Their feedback will maybe be valuable, but it's probably going to confirm something I already know, which is that I shouldn't be marketing that game to purely to heavy gamers unless I know they also have kids. So if that group is walking by and they've also got 3 or 4 7-year-olds in tow, or younger, I might say, okay, perfect. They're going to be looking. They're gamers that want to bring their kids or maybe their family into the hobby. This is the perfect game for them. So there's that knowing your game and knowing who it suits. I think really directs that in terms of how you want to test. At the same time, if you're unsure. There's nothing wrong, I think, with having a few test runs with a group that doesn't align with your target audience to better understand if there's an opportunity there. Like maybe with a rule change, the game suddenly gains a sophistication that makes it cater to that other group. Or maybe that it's an idea for an expansion or further components and things. So it's worth testing, but with respect to letting them know what they're getting into, because you don't want to have people sit down at your table expecting one experience and they get up and go, well, you tricked me into playing your game. That's not good for anybody.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. It's valuable to have all perspectives on the game, because if you complete the game and put it out in the world, you have no control over who gets to play it. So you want to know exactly how a first person who's never really played games, how they will take the game, how they will approach it, what it means to them. But at the same time, you want to know the other extreme, where someone is who buys at least 5 games a month as kind of an extreme, and they constantly play board games, so they've seen every mechanic under the sky. So you want to at least get their opinion on it, because for all you know, they might also like it, or they might tell you, well, actually, I've played this exact game, like, last year on the 4th of July, as an example. It's just like, and they know this game, and you're like, oh, didn't even know this game existed, because, it's some obscure thing. But beyond just that, having a similarity of the game, it's also good because they understand all these mechanics, how they approach it. Does it make sense to them? And you can also take their knowledge, and if you have the rules document kind of printed out and show them the rules, and okay, would you as an experienced gamer understand this and do the same thing to a person, a very casual person who hasn't played these games? Do these rules make sense to you without telling you how the game works first, and then go from there?
I would say you can't do that until you understand your target audience, because there's a danger in having a heavyweight gamer sitting down to your casual game. I ran into this with Take the Gold quite a bit, actually, which was that I'd have friends who design games sit down and be like, man, I like your game, but it'd be great if there was this, like, if there was a card in it that allowed me to go do these 3 things in combination with other things. And it's like that's not a bad idea for a different game. But if your game is targeting 7-year-olds and above, like family gamers that you're trying to get them weaned off of Monopoly, or like, God, no, don't play that, please play anything else, play this. You're trying to get them away from those stereotypical casual games, like casual family games. Having someone sit down and tell you, well, here's a great way, like, to chain together a 5-hit combo in your game that is all about like one-on-one exchanges. It's a good way to go off the rails real quickly. So as long as you understand your audience and what they're seeking, it's great to get that heavier or hardcore gamer advice, or that non-audience member advice, as long as you're not the kind of person who's going to immediately incorporate that and risk cutting off your actual target and majority audience.
Yeah, that's definitely a thing we've seen with Department of Spin too. Is the rules are very simple, and we try to keep them simple for a specific reason. And there are a lot of usually more experienced players that we played it, and as soon as they start playing it, they understand it, and they're like, oh, but it'd be really cool if you have these rules. I'm like, yes, it would be really cool, and some of these things will actually have as alternate rule sets that you can play with the game. But in the end, we don't want to complicate the game without any reason, really.
Yeah.
If it doesn't need to be complicated, if it's fine as is, it'll just be for a specific type of person or player. It would be a little bit more interesting if these other rules were enacted. Then yeah, we could definitely think about that.
And that's always a very interesting challenge, especially when it comes to video game design. And as you guys said about trying to figure out who your market is, and while you're still trying to appeal to them, you still want to try and shoot to get new people in, whether it's by making a casual game appealing to core gamers or going the other way around. But as you said in that same breath, you always run that risk of kind of diluting the purpose of your game to begin with. And we've seen examples of games like that that either approach things from such a casual side that anyone who's core hardcore comes in there like, what am I playing? Why should I play this game? You know, it's so boring to me. But then you have, on the other hand, you're trying to get someone into a very popular series. Like, for me, I'll talk about like the games from like Paradox Interactive, like Europa Universalis, Solaris, like these complex games that, like as you said, like some tabletop games that take days to run. This is a game that can take like a month or two to go through an entire campaign, and you're trying to get someone new to play that stuff, and they go in. It's like, what in the hell is this thing? How am I supposed to figure this thing out? And you always run that risk of, you know, trying to make something instead of appealing to everyone, you're making it that appeals to no one instead.
Yeah, good point. Because just because you've catered now to your hardcore gamer in your family game, you've added a rule for them, doesn't mean they're going to come around and buy it when the time comes. So you've potentially completely ruined your audience or your market by trying to cater to everybody. It's better to target an audience for sure.
Yeah, it's interesting. You brought up Paradox, and I really like a lot of their games too. Which one of the, well, it's not their game, but kind of similar idea to the kind of games that they tend to make. Is one of my favorite games is Dominions.
I knew you were going to say that.
I had to. No one knows about it because it is at first it's such a complicated game. And I think I've told like everyone I know and then some. And I people have bought it, but I don't think anyone's really played it past like the first 20 minutes.
Actually did beta testing on Dominions 3 from Shrapnel way back, but I had no idea what I was doing to play that game. Like, there is nothing I can offer you because I don't know what this game is. And yeah, that's exactly the same way. And it's also very challenging, like keeping with this theme of trying to build an audience, is very challenging to create an audience for something that's very niche or very unique because you have no idea, you know, where that audience is going to come from. Like, I'll give you an example. Something like Stardew Valley, for instance, really struck a chord with the Harvest Moon farming simulator kind of crowd. So there was a market for that kind of game before. But then I can think of games such as, have you guys ever heard of the game Duskers, the indie game?
It's what's the name?
Duskers, Duskers.
I've heard the name. I haven't played it.
It's a game around dirty tech. You're controlling robots in space, and you're typing in all the commands in like a little command lock in the bottom left of the screen. And it's part roguelike and management and even some horror. And it's like, where would that market have come from? Like a game like that, it's very hard to like sit down and say, I'm going to appeal to so-and-so. And it's always that very trickiness when you're trying to appeal to something that there's never been a game like that before. Now, I guess here's a question. Going back to what you were saying a few minutes ago, Americo, regarding the rule set. Now, as we said, when it comes to a tabletop, you will generally have someone there who knows what's going on. Either yourself or someone who's bought the game and playing it like that. I guess like this is one of the things, like for me as someone who doesn't have that background on tabletop, is trying to understand the rules themselves. Like, how do you write this up or make this so that to make it so that someone can understand what's going on, or to be able to at least grasp it? Like, I'll give you an example. My friends made me play the board game based off, I think, Doom. I forget. I think it was like Doom 3, the board game. And they left like the rule page like at the bottom. And again, I look at that thing, I'm like, what the hell is this thing? Like, I have no idea what I'm looking at here. And again, it goes back to that whole thing of you look at this thing and it's just like a bunch of gobbledygook and hieroglyphics as someone who's never sat down and seen this stuff before.
Yeah, well, the rules are sometimes one of the a game in its own, except they're I guess there's a winner. If they're clear enough, you get a winner.
Anyone who gets to play the game is a winner at that point.
Yeah, if you get a message across, but it's just getting that balance of putting enough information in there so that people will understand how to play it, but not so much information in there that their eyes glaze over as soon as they see the 15-page, rule book that you just threw in front of them. So it's luckily with our games we've had, well, game I should say, but also kind of applies to Take the Goal as well. It's a simple game, so the rules don't need to be 15 pages long. There aren't that many variables where you would need to say, if this happens, you do this. But if this happens, you do this. Also, if this happens in combination with this, then you do something completely different. There isn't that kind of complexity. So with both Take the Goal and Department Spin, I think, and you feel free to correct me if I'm wrong here, it was a lot easier to do that because the concept of the game, the gameplay itself, is relatively simple. But we've played games before, definitely, that it's such an involved game that 3 pages in, we're only halfway through the actual rules and we're still setting up the actual board, and we just it's having never played it before, I don't even know what I'm really doing. I'm just following step by step the instructions, and the more I read, the more I don't want to play the game because it just seems like it's getting more and more complex, and I don't know what the payoff is. So I'm not going to mention any names, but it's
only good plugs.
Only good plugs. But it is a challenge to making sure that your game is understood and is playable. So I don't know if you want to add on.
Rules writing, there's a lot on this actually, so I'll try to keep it concise. Rules writing is as much art as it is science, even for simple games. So even Take the Goal, we labored over the rule book in its entirety is basically if you consolidate, it's a flip, not a flip book, but like kind of an accordion style. It is basically one letter size sheet of paper. If you take out the visuals, it's half that. So not even. So it's not a long document, and that's. We could have we got the rules down to slightly less than what I had written it down to for the game that became Take the Goal. So it's definitely an art in terms of making it. There's a certain something about it that's undefinable. There's a lot of science to it too, in terms of communicating as clearly and concisely a process. I mean, that's what it is. The rules are the engine of your game, and you're trying to or the programming code, if you will, and you're trying to program that code into a human being's head so they can execute it. So it's got to be as simple and easy to understand as possible. Even for that 15-page book, it should be readable cover to cover. When I'm going on a flight or something and I've exhausted everything else I want to do, I'll sometimes pull up PDFs of rule books for games I haven't played yet, just to read them, which is a weird, torturous task sometimes. But it's an interesting exercise in trying to see, can you understand from a document, can you visualize how the game would play? And that's a key thing. So when you have that 15-page, when you have Doom the video game, or you have I think even a short rule book that I read before playing, I think it was Agricola or something, and even that I found was it's not super complicated, and I was like, okay, this rule book reading it end to end is a little bit weird. So it goes back, I think, to Oscar's question earlier. That's the thing where if you can't get anything shorter than a 15-page rule book, and you want casual players, then your theme had better be Doom. It better be something that has that instant hook for an audience that would never play a game with a 15-page rulebook. So that's your only saving grace if you want to go after a casual audience, is to have that theme or that IP, like that licensed Doom or something, that has that ultimate hook that will bring people kicking and screaming, like, I don't want to read a 15-page rulebook, but I love ripping and tearing, so therefore I'm going to play Doom the board game. That's what you have to achieve there. But Yeah, it's definitely that. There are professional rulebook editors out there that you can seek out. Publishers obviously do that, but on your own, you never want to be the only person reading your rulebook because you know your game. So you're never going to catch. It's like when you write a short story, you write your paper to hand in English or whatever. You wrote it. You're going to miss typos. You're going to miss, even if you're an expert grammar, you're going to miss it. Editing is important no matter what.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, as much as you want to test your game, you also have to test the rule book.
Totally.
It's just as important, if not more important than just you need to test the rule book with people who've never seen your game, never played it, never heard of it, just to see, does this make sense? And then have them play the game with the rule book only, and then, okay, now after you played the game, do you have any questions that the rule book didn't answer? It's really an underrated aspect of game design is the rule book.
Yeah, that's one of the things when you're doing when you're play testing. I'm sure you got into this with John at some length. There's different phases. There's when you sit there and you teach the game, and then at some point you want to come up with a rule doc that you read to the players, and then you want to sit in the room with them and have them read, which is probably the single most painful thing as a designer to do, is say, here are the rules. I'm going to sit in that corner and I'm not there. Don't look at me. Don't think about me. Just act natural with this document. And you have to sit there and watch people struggle with things that you thought were simple. And half the time you're like, oh man, they're idiots. And most of the time, though, really you're like, oh God, I'm an idiot. And it's just this struggle of a process. And then there's blind play testing where you ship your baby off to somebody and you say, don't call me, set up a camera or an audio recorder or something and tell me how you did and give me that recording. But you don't get involved. There's no divine intervention. At that point, you're the divine. You can't intervene. You set your, I think it's deism or something. You've created your clock, and the gears are turning, and you got to watch it go. You can't intervene at that point. So that's the ultimate test of rules. And if you haven't done that with a game, then there's no way you know that it's ready for prime time. You might be Kickstarter ready if you know that you've tested it with the rules properly explained, and that buys you some time to take the kinks out of your rule book. But if you're going to retail or going to a publisher with a rule doc that you haven't blind tested, there's don't do it. Just don't. Under no circumstances.
Oscar was saying in chat, I guess just to clarify, so you actually test the game with just the rule book and not having the game there. Like, is that a way that you're testing it?
That's it. One way. I do that more as a sick sort of self-torture, is reading books without seeing the game components. But Oscar, yes, that's one thing you can do, is you can say to a person, here, before you look at the components, here's a rule book. I want you to and this is best for short rules. If you have a 15-page rule doc and no bits and bobs, this just maybe do this to someone you hate. But for shorter rules, you can sit them down in someone's hand and say, just read this and see if you can recap it section by section. So read the setup and describe to me what you do. Of course, in the real world, they're going to have the components, so there's no harm in skipping this step. But if you really want to just nail your testing down, that would definitely be a suitable thing to do. Again, with a short one, it's doing that in a vacuum without components probably isn't the most effective testing, but it's an interesting exercise to see if the language is at least coming across without the distraction of the components.
That's a great way to test your grammar.
Yes. Just to do a quick time check, we are just about over an hour and a half in, not counting our pre-stream. So I figure we'll probably begin to wrap things up in the next, I would say, 10 to 15 minutes, give or take. So for you folks watching this live right now, I would say this will be kind of a warning for, or last warning for questions. If you have anything for Ali and Mirko regarding play testing and tabletop design. But with that said, I guess I have a few more questions and then I'll throw it over to you guys, see if there's anything else we missed. But I guess one thing that I want to talk about, and going back to what Oscar was saying earlier regarding like motifs and designing the interface for a tabletop game, I guess for both of you, are there like any, like when it comes to tabletop design, are there any like standard elements, or like when I talk to John, like affordances that are easy to grasp, like for a new player, that are like that kind of become like the standards when it comes to designing your tabletop game?
I would say it probably falls into like writing archetypes as well in a way. The idea of archetypes, like as far as those standard motifs, is that kind of what you're asking about in terms of just the gold standards in those things?
Yeah, like the motifs, or like the design of the board, or design of figures, or something that has kind of become like universal. Like for video games, for instance, like we've seen like the universal, like for gamepads, like how all the gamepads these days have a standard design, or how all platformers will use the A button for jumping, or the right trigger for first-person shooters, stuff like that.
Yeah. I mean, there's a lot of them, I'd say. I was thinking in terms of archetypes, like you've also got the idea of, I think it was a couple years back, there was a panel I saw where there was this guy, Aldo, from Impressions. They're a game consolidator. But anyway, he said they were talking about the saleability on the flip side of it, beyond design, just marketability. If something's got an alien, a zombie, a pirate, a knight, or an explosion on the box, it's going to sell better than something else. So there's that side of it in terms of those images instantly trigger a certain concept to us. We know, okay, if there's werewolves in it, I'm probably going to have a fight with a werewolf, and that's probably going to be fun. So I'm already starting to get there in terms of buying this game. So there's that side of it. But in terms of like thematics of components and mechanics and things, for example, like if you need a number randomizer, you're probably going to have dice. You're not going to want to necessarily shuffle. Like if you need a D20, you don't need 20 cards numbered 1 through 20 shuffled together. You draw one at random. Although there are some games that use that kind of randomization mechanism for things other than a number. But for a number randomization, dice are probably what you're going to want to do. You may not want to grab your phone and develop a number randomizing app, or have someone rely on that just with the component in the box. So there's certain expectations like that. Might be a good one. Everything should be in the box. That's a basic expectation that I think sometimes designers think of shortcuts to try to save money, and that does work. I think that's what Cheap Ass Games does. Is they have you they provide you only the components you need for the game, that specific game, and they have you borrow, use pennies or use dice from their stuff to pass the savings on to you. Mm-hmm. But that doesn't work for just any designer. Yeah. So you do want to include everything. But in terms of those standards, the board layouts and things, it depends really on the mechanics of the game. Like, right. If you're gonna have specific card placement, don't tell people to remember a sequence of placements of piles of cards. Give them a mat or a board or something to slot those into. Mm-hmm. They're gonna have pawns or something. If you're gonna have a specific set of cards or components that line up with a specific player position, have them all be the same color. So there's stuff like that. A lot of it's, I guess I can venture to call it common sense. But it's a good question. It's a very important thing to remember, is that what you're trying to do ultimately is play to people's, the accessibility of it by identifying expectations people have, fulfilling those, but ideally playing off of them into a twist. You want to give them a hook of accessibility, but as soon as they get comfortable, you want to shift it to something new and exciting so they don't get comfortable, or stay comfortable, I guess.
So they're not basically getting bored with the game. Like, they're just seeing it as just, oh, this is just like Risk, or this is just like Monopoly. And then they get tired. You need to say, it may start like that, but now here's so-and-so. Like, this is where like the hook of the game comes in, or the meat of it.
Yeah, when it comes to games, board should always be spelled B-O-A-R-D, not the other one. So.
True. Now, so it's really a lot of little things that kind of apparent, but may not necessarily be. Some people like to try and make their game more unique, so they'll try to reinvent the wheel, as it were. So, for example, why do I need to score up? Why don't I go, negatives? And the person with the most negative number is the winner. Why? What's the point of that? Unless you have an extremely good reason why that is a part of your game, why teach that to a person? Go, in negative, subtract, where you can just do the standard thing and count up.
Totally.
As an example. So things like that. If you have a mechanic that's already out there, there's no reason to rename it. There's no reason to recreate it.
Yes.
Make it different. It's already there. Just use it.
Yeah, a great example of that actually was there's a game that I'm working on, and it's not done for reasons I'm about to explain. So basically, it's called I Didn't Eat That. It's a tentative working title, but it's a game where you're trying to get out of paying the check at dinner. So it's a reverse trick taker or trick avoider. If you're familiar with that mechanic, it's a pretty common one. And so when I was running this at a playtesting event, A guy from I think it was Daniel from Mayday Games sat down and played it. And he's like, I like the theme. Like everyone loved the theme actually when I did the initial pitch, and said like the idea behind the game, but the fundamental break point psychologically was in this game. A card is revealed, an item from the check that you're going to pay, like a steak with veggies on the side or something like that. And you're holding a set of excuses in your hand. And each of those is, I didn't eat, or rather the card says, I ate veggies, not spicy food or something. So basically you're trying to play a card that says, no, I didn't eat that thing. And so the point that he made was, in most card games, I'm trying to match positively on symbols, not negatively. So I'm trying to say, meat and meat, yes, they go together. I get to keep those or something. Not meat, not meat. I don't take that, but someone else might. So it was a game that, like, once people understood it, like kids like of all ages played it, it was fine. But that was that fundamental. I noticed people pausing on obvious decisions because their brains are going match colors, not unmatch or discard based on a type of card. So just avoiding that fundamental psychological dispute is important in terms of game design.
Yeah, and that is especially true among the games that I've played, and I've seen that, Trav, especially among first-time or even like somewhat established independent developers who will try and reinvent the wheel, as you guys say, on things that you don't need to do that on. For instance, like I said with a platformer, the A button has been the universal jump button since Mario. You don't want to have a platformer where left trigger is jump. And you want to, as you said, you want to avoid like those mental hurdles that only really serve to complicate your design. And as you said, if someone has done it better or it's easier understood, or as Oscar said in chat, if something has become a standard, don't ignore that. Because if people already know that and it's something you don't have to teach them or reinvent the wheel on, that's one less, hurdle for someone trying to learn your game.
Totally. You can use that. It saves you some explanation.
Yeah, I mean, I know I can probably name a few games off the top of my head just where the game concept was cool, the game story, everything was kind of cool, but then the controls were just weird. So as a person that primarily plays PC games, as an example, so whenever I play a port from a console on the PC, it just feels, and they haven't actually made the controls native to the PC user. It is immediately apparent. Like, as soon as I know nothing about the game, as soon as I put my hands on that keyboard and mouse and start playing it, and I notice certain things, I'm like, okay, this is a port. I don't even know what the game is.
It feels like the keys are just like haphazardly assigned on the thing. Like, press W for movement and then press semicolon to attack. It's like, how are my hands supposed to work this keyboard to play your game?
Yeah, and the weirdest thing is when you're playing something like that and it tells you like, okay, hit A to attack. I'm going, no, that's not what.
That's not supposed to be.
That's strafe left.
Yeah, that's not how I want to do that.
Yeah, that was back in the early days of first-person shooters on PC. Well, I should say back in the first days of mouse look. You had that battle between inversion of axis, and it was like, okay, everybody does move mouse up to look up. Why are you inverting the axis?
Oh God, yes.
Yeah. So that's one of those things where you, as a tabletop, well, in all games, but going back to tabletop, some people don't want to play similar. Once they find out, this reminds me of this other game, they avoid it like the plague because they think, I don't want to taint the well. No, you go play that game as quickly as possible because one, you're going to find things that they're like, that's cool, but I could have done it better. Well, maybe I should. You're also going to avoid duplicating a game. It exists. You have to know about it. But also you're going to find those things of, okay, I was struggling with how I did my number randomization. Look, they did this really elegant way of doing that. Yes. So you always, it's like that. There's a book about it called Steal Like an Artist. It's something that everybody does. There's very little that's new in terms of purely new. Mm-hmm. It's the twist that's new. You bring them in with the accessibility, with the familiar theme, with whatever it is that they could latch onto. There's your like twist or your spice. There's the core, the bedrock they can like really dig into and hang on to as the familiarity. And then just when they get comfortable, you throw a curveball at them that goes, okay, cool, I haven't done this before, and now I'm invested.
iterating essentially on someone else's work. You're making it your own while still having that base foundation that everyone associates to. And I mean, I could spend the next hour naming all the games I've played that have used that kind of inspiration. And as you said, Ali, like, if someone has done this better or has figured out the solution, why, rack your head over trying to create something equal when you can just move on and go with something that go with your new idea with that foundation?
Yeah, and the most, I haven't lived it, thankfully, and I hope never to, but the worst thing you probably can ever experience is you pour a year or 2 years in your heart and soul into a game, you go to Kickstarter or something, sight unseen, and the first thing you hear is, oh yeah, this is just that other game with your wizard has a gray hat instead of a white hat. And like, what the hell do you do then, right?
I've heard many indie developers have that nightmare that wakes them up in the middle of the night, for sure.
Oh, yeah. You're always going to have that, like, someone's going to come up and say, oh, this is like blank. That's not necessarily a bad thing. If you haven't played blank, then you ask about blank. You say, okay, tell me more about the similarity. And they might say, oh yeah, it's like blank, but this. And you're like, okay, good, I'm not exactly the same. And then either way, you go play blank if you haven't already. And even if you have, maybe go play it with an eye on this if you didn't already occur to you. But the last thing you want to be doing is rehashing someone else's work. Without adding your own twist or your own compelling reason why this should also be played. If it's already been made, why are you doing it again?
Yeah.
Oh, right. I have one final question for the two, and this will probably be the big one that will take us to the end. So, again, for you folks watching this live, if you have any questions for us, please get them in now, or we're going to lock things up. But here's the question, and again, I think this one could either be a very long answer or a very short answer, depending upon what you guys think. But keeping with this idea, again, of the challenge of designing a game for the casual market, when it comes to, like, building, like, the rules or building the design of your tabletop game, I guess my question is there such a thing as making it too casual? As in, the game is too simplistic that it's not going to hold anyone's attention. And I guess to kind of expand on that, like, when you're just coming up with the rules for your game or just the design in general, how do you decide that break point of, this is how far I want to take my game in terms of complexity? This kind of goes back to what you were saying earlier when, like, a core or hardcore person sat down, played your game, and said, it would be cool if we have, advanced moves or advanced cards. So I guess, how do you, decide just what is the limit in terms of complexity or simplicity when it comes to your tabletop?
I think that one is, when it comes down to it, it's the question of, do I want to play this again? And it's that replayability that really matters. You can have the simplest game with practically no rules, just a 2-sentence rule, and that could be fine as long as I play that game and I get to the end and I go, that was cool, I want to play that again. You're fine. But if you play a game and you're like, well, I just went through the motions and I understand the game completely and I went through the motions, but I was in no way invested in the game, and I played it, it's fine, there's nothing broken, it's just not fun. Then yeah, at that point of the game is like, what's the point? So I guess a simplistic answer to that question.
I think there's two components to it, and one of them is absolutely replayability. I mean, simple isn't necessarily bad. In fact, simple is usually good. It's unsophisticated that's probably bad more than simple. But I would say that, is unsophisticated actually a word? Anyway, I'll look that up later. So,
Sounds like a word.
But yeah, it's got enough letters to be a word. Let's just go with it. There's some consonants and vowels in there. Great. I look at, like, war, for example. Like, high card wins trick taker, basically, where that's it. It's about as simple as a game can get, and yet that still holds people's attention, especially in a casino where there's money involved. But even without the money, it still works because there's an unpredictability. So that's the other. I would say there's replayability. Absolutely, you have to have more than one go of a game unless it's Russian roulette or something. And so the other side of it, then, I'd say, is the predictability. As long as there's some element of suspense that makes the ending of the game uncertain, and that goes into some more complex topics of game design, like things like king making and stuff like that, where you want to avoid, you don't ever want there to be this obvious ending before you arrive at that ending.
Yeah.
The climax of the game and the resolution should be, in my opinion, as close as possible together for that reason. So as long as it isn't too predictable, as long as like war, you put your card face down, you don't know what anyone else has put, you flip them over, and then you decide, okay, yay, there was some moment of suspense, a climax and a resolution right there. So you can have a really simple game as long as it is replayable and unpredictable. Of course, with having simple, unpredictable, and replayable all in the same, all kind of the same holy triumvirate of game design, it's probably been done. So you're gonna be hard pressed to find a way to do those three things as tightly as possible. So you may start to give. It's like that kind of, it's your time, cost, and quality triangle all over again, where basically you start to pull one of those levers, you start to make it more simple, and you may lose some replayability or some unpredictability. But then again, genius games of that match that description come out all the time. Yeah. So that I would say is too casual. Not as long as there's an audience for it, and there's tabletop is growing. It's in its renaissance right now, and more people are coming. More filthy casual non-tabletop gamers are coming across all the time. So there's definitely an ever hungry and evergreen audience for it, and I'm looking forward to seeing where it goes from here.
Mm-hmm. And I think you made a really good point there that streamline and simple aren't mutually exclusive. Like there's for a lot of people, there are those who will decry any kind of streamline to a game, saying that they're, dumbing it down for people, or as we said, the filthy casuals. But the easier that you can explain your game, or at least get the foot in the door, it then opens it up to allow someone to explore that. As we said earlier in the podcast, like, you walk into a room and you see, 4 tables put together, everything just, like, spread out. It's like, I have no idea what I'm looking at here. Why would I want to sit here and try and learn it? But if you can set things up to make it very approachable, so as we said before, with either having like clear archetypes or just having things look very presentable, it makes it easier for someone to start grasping, and then you start to, as we've said, sort of like bring in the complexities or the unique elements of your game to try and get those points across to someone once they've already become established. Oh.
Sorry, maybe I missed the question.
No, there wasn't a question there. I was just. But sorry. I know it is.
Total agreement. Those were that was a silence of agreement there.
Yeah.
You've absolutely got to have. There's got to be. I guess it goes back to like, what is a game even in a way? It's like, okay, there's a series of meaningful decisions. Hopefully, there's some suspense and uncertainty about an ending, and there is the desire to do it all again. So if you can hit those marks, then it's just a question of how. I mean, that to me is the core definition of the game anyway. So fun optional, I guess potentially, but
it's got to be fun.
But what is fun?
There's
a whole other there's a whole other side of that conversation. But fun is definitely subjective. I don't know the meaningful or decision making, at least maybe meaningfulness is subjective, but you from there it's a question of what you want to build around those concepts, right? Do you want to have a bunch of extremely complicated movement and targeting actions involving attacks? Do you want to be cooperative in this? That's where you skin the game with every possible layer of mechanic and theme and everything from there. So I definitely agree that whether you've got a game where it's just a single deck of cards, like seeing just a deck of cards on a table, like I can say from experience, like at a con with my one draw deck sitting on the middle of the table looks very empty to me. And to a lot of players who walk up, even if they're casuals, they're like, what's going on here? Like, I see a deck of cards and nothing else. Like, there's gotta be, it's not always bad to have a lot of stuff going on, as long as you can make sense of it visually. Yeah. Or again, if you have, maybe you're pulling a bunch of war gamers over and they just want to see absolute chaos on that table and be excited to dive in and fight that battle, or depending on what the game is. So you've really got, it's just a question of targeting that audience ultimately.
Yeah. And again, we start talking about like visual and aesthetic design, we'll be here for easily another hour, so like it's nothing.
Easily.
But I think it's going to probably be time to wrap things up. I guess going back to my question then, regarding the, again, like the core hardcore side of things, how do you decide, again, like where that line is? Like, how complex do I want to make my game?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, I guess
you want to start there, and
I'll start. I mean, the game it depends on the kind of game you want to make, and it's really what your vision for that game is. So if you're thinking, I want this game to be world domination game, you're not going to make a simple world domination game that you can finish in less than half an hour. Generally not. You're always going to be a bit more meaty. There's going to be more to it. So at that point, you have to decide, well, how complicated do I want to make this game? Do I want to make it so that I can play it within an hour? Am I fine with having this game go 3 hours? You know, so you have to kind of make that decision, and it's not sometimes the mechanic that pops into your head will kind of dictate that a little bit, but at the same time, you have to make that choice. So it's again not an easy question to answer because it really depends on what your end goal is for the game. So it could be a 3 hour world domination game, or it could be that you're just playing a, I don't know, a world dictator in a very small kind of a setting where you want to play an aspect of world domination that's going to take you 20 minutes. So it really depends on what your end goal is.
Yeah, I mean, that's kind of where the marriage of mechanic and theme, or content and theme, come into play. If you want to have a game where you experience world domination, does half an hour even feel like long enough for that? Like,
right.
It may be you may find the perfect streamlined system for world domination, but it doesn't give you that epic feeling of world domination, so it may be a mismatch. I had an interesting conversation with this about this with John actually the other day, where there was a term he had used and that we found we were using differently, and we both had our reasons. Gateway game, as opposed to necessarily a casual game, which can be similar. There's definitely a relationship there, from my perspective at least. You have the concept that I look at a gateway game as a game for casual players that operates as a gateway into tabletop, or into a specific genre of tabletop that's accessible, easy to digest, and then introduce them to a mechanic. Like Sushi Go is a prime example. It's just it's not even I have a hard time calling it a drafting game. It's a fine game, but like, it's just drafting. Like, there's nothing else happening the whole. There's set collection, but it really takes place in the form of its drafting. And so that's just taking a pure mechanic and turning into a gateway game, where now that a player has played and enjoyed Sushi Go, I can go to my shelf and say, well, here's Seven Wonders. This is also drafting. You're good at this, but there's a little more meat here for you. So they've had that gateway drug of Sushi Go to get them into drafting tabletop games. So in terms of like making that choice of whether you target hardcore or whether you target casual, yeah, it depends absolutely, as Mirko said, on the kind of game, the kind of people you like to play games with. But also, I think there's definitely, if there's a theme you're going for, marrying that up to the right set of mechanics, so you don't say, come and dominate the world with me, and we're going to do it by drafting cards in 10 minutes. Like, that doesn't that falls a little flat. Right. On the other hand, I don't necessarily want to play a gardening game. Like, I don't want to like grow plants and have it involve 45 different colors of cubes on a board the size of 3 tables, and it takes 6 hours to play. I just want to grow some damn plants. So there's that alignment of theme, audience, and mechanic basically. But it's a decision, at least for me so far, that has come out kind of naturally out of playtesting. You very quickly find out if your cute corgi pirate game, if you're trying to sit there and play it with war gamers, you very quickly realize this is not a hardcore game. And if I want to make it a hardcore game, it will not be the same game anymore. So that comes out very quickly by playing with other people.
All right. I think I know we are now just about hit 2 hours. I'm sure we all need to refill our drinks and probably rest after all that. But I think it is time to wrap things up. And if you guys are always free, and I think Mike as well, you said, we can certainly have you guys back on either for a record or live cast in the future. But
I'd love to do it again.
Yeah, absolutely.
I guess my final question for you guys before we end things on, I guess actually 2. The first one is, are there any aspects that we didn't touch on that you would like to bring or that you were thinking about before the cast when it comes to this kind of play testing or casual design?
Not really. Not that I've we've had on pretty much everything that I thought about beforehand. So, well.
Yeah, I guess sort of it goes into a lot of what we said, but just that casual gamers are gamers too, even if they don't know
absolutely.
it yet. Everybody loves games and entertainment, and there's a huge audience of people that I wouldn't necessarily look at. I don't want to classify them as customers or a market. I don't want to just attach dollars to it. I mean, there's that. But also, the larger the gaming community grows, the more people we have to play games with, the more evergreen games become, because it's just always that shame when that game you love, you log on to the server or you go to a local meetup and like no one is playing that game anymore. That's a terrible moment. So the more people we bring into the hobby, whether it's video gaming or tabletop, the more people are to play with, the more games get made, the more those games can flourish. So the casual gamers, I feel like, I play with a lot of local designers. There are a lot of people doing deck builders and Euro games and things which are fantastic. For me, there's definitely a soft spot in my heart for casual games. I have heavier weight games in mind that I want to develop, but I'd love to spend more time in casual because there's a broader audience. It's great to be able to sit down with non-gamers and they go like, wow, I've only ever played Uno. I had no idea I could have so much fun with 54 cards and not have a casino dealer staring at me from across the table. So it's a great audience to work with. And I don't know. I could go on about it like for another 2 hours, but I'll cut myself short there.
Awesome. Yeah, I know the same thing. Like I've been doing presentations at my local libraries about video games in the industry, and it's very interesting to talk to people who aren't eat, sleep, and drinking this kind of stuff 24 hours a day, and being able to talk to them about it. And it is very interesting to get like their thoughts, and sometimes you may win over those fans who will then start looking at things on their own. Or as you said a few minutes ago, like the kind of like the gateway game, getting them from playing this one game to then playing another game, and then another one, and so on and so forth.
Yeah, I guess actually one thing to tack on to that would be going back to some of the crowdfunding that we've been talking about and things like that. Like the casual audience, also the thing to bear in mind when engaging with them is they aren't necessarily going to be, they may love your game, they may be enthusiastic about it, but they still oftentimes default to going into a brick and mortar store on Amazon and buying a game. They like if you get 1,000 people, 1,000 casual gamers who have never heard of Kickstarter before telling you they love your game, they may not be guaranteed backers. So it's a thing to bear in mind when designing for and potentially going to self-publish for that audience, that you have to work harder, I'd say, to get them hyped up, get them engaged, get them backing, especially when you need them backing on day one to get your initial bump. So it's an important thing to remember that you have to take casual gamer feedback with a grain of salt. They don't always know that it's important for them, like in playtesting, to tell you about problems. They're all too happy to tell you, yeah, I loved your game. It was a lot of fun. And yeah, I totally would play it again. And cool, thanks, see ya. They don't always get that as a designer, you need to hear, dude, I'm sorry, but I didn't understand what the heck I was doing half the time. So it's an interesting audience to work with. It's a great audience to play with. But they sometimes need some education on how to test, or they may not make the best testers, which is a really tough thing. You got to find casual players, if they're your audience, to play your game, but they've also got to be able to give you the feedback you need to make it a good game great.
Definitely. All right, so I think with that said, do you guys have any final thoughts you'd like to end on, anything you'd like to say to fans, or something just to tie a bow on our little discussion for tonight?
I don't know. Well, kind of mirroring that, there are a lot of people that don't necessarily get into the big meaty games, and they're being part of the gaming community for most of my life, not all of it. There is a bit of kind of pushback sometimes. They're like, oh, what games do you play? Like, oh, I play Bubble Witch Saga or whatever on my phone, and that's about it. Those are games too, and there is that natural kind of, oh, well, that's not a game. You just like swiping left or right, basically. But it is a game, and these are gamers in a sense. Maybe not the same kind of gamer that has spent, 10 years of their life in World of Warcraft, but they're still gamers, and it goes along with board games as well. That person who plays Uno, they understand a mechanic, and what Uno has been done and redone in many other games, and just added on different aspects of it. So regardless of what games you play or what games you're trying to make, there's going to be a market in there. You just have to find those right people.
And assuming that the audience, that most of the people watching this are going to be game designers or have a game in mind, just as I guess this final thought from me, because I could just go on all night because I'm loving this, but the final thought from me would be on that. If you are thinking about making a game, just get out in the community. Don't hold back in terms of talking to other designers about your idea. Ideas are priceless, but they're also worthless. It's execution that counts. So really getting out there, engaging with the community, showing your game to people, playing other people's games. Don't just show up to a game night and expect people to play your game. Like, go out and do some play testing, offer value, and that's the quickest way to get yourself to the table then with your game and start really developing something great.
Awesome. All right, so again, like, we could probably stay here for another 2 to 3 hours and chat, but I'm sure it's definitely late over here. I'm sure it's getting late where you guys are as well. What time is it, by the way?
It's 8:15. Yeah.
Right.
And it's a little bit past 11 here, so I'm sure we're all starting to feel it. But like I say, if you guys are free in the future, it'll be more than great to catch up with you and talk more about tabletop design, just about anything else we can come across.
Yeah, no, love to.
Would love to do that.
All right. And oh yeah, and of course, definitely for those of you watching this either live or record, check out the Department of Spin Kickstarter. You guys, as of this recording or this stream, there are 10 days left, so definitely best of luck to you guys with that. And yep, like I said, we can easily, if we want to, we could just segue into probably another talk, but I'm sure we all need to get going at some point.
Yeah, no, sounds good. And if you're going to link contact info or whatever, I was going to say, I'm sure, I don't want to speak on your behalf necessarily, but it's a topic we love and care about, so we're always happy to talk with, designers, and anybody with questions or anything can always reach us through. I think all the contact info that would probably be relevant is at strifecards.com, but the email addresses, Twitter, Facebook, the whole bit. That's probably the best way to find us in one location.
All right.
Yeah, absolutely. Any of that. We love talking about the subject, obviously. So, any questions or anything else, we'd be happy to engage.
Awesome. All right. If you guys wouldn't mind, just hang on for like 30 seconds when we end the stream. So I'll ask you a few post-chat questions, but we'll end things here for the folks. So if you've been watching us, whether it's live or record, thank you so much for tuning in. Be sure to like and subscribe to the channel for daily discussions on game design. Check out Department of Spin as well as your other games. And like I said, if you guys wouldn't mind sending me over those links to where you guys like to post, I'll be sure to include those in the description below. But for those of you watching me live right now, I'll be back on probably in like 30 minutes or so with some game streaming here on the channel. But that's going to do it for tonight's cast. So again, Ali, Mirko, thank you so much for coming on. And yeah, it was definitely a great time for these last, it feels like we've just started talking, but it's already been about 2 hours.
Yeah.
No, it was our pleasure. Thank you for having us on.
Yeah, thanks for that.
Not a problem. So, with all that said, for you folks enjoying this, thanks for tuning in. Check out everything that we've mentioned, and I will be seeing you all again real soon for another live chat. And if you are a developer or someone who likes talking about game design industry, we are always looking for new guests, so please don't hesitate to get in touch. But that is going to do it. So, have a great night, everybody, and I'll see you all later with some more games. But until then, take care.